Sadhguru Muji Ji Ki Jai. Sadhguru Nanta Ji Ki Jai. Sadhguru Christ Ki Jai.
We're going to take the first moment or two of this meditation to simply do nothing. What could it mean to just sit down and do nothing? To not be concerned about how we're sitting, or the state of our mind, or the state of our feelings. To not be concerned with trying to change anything at all. To ask yourself, what is it to just sit down and do nothing? It's not the kind of question that you look for an answer. It's just the kind of question that you pose and then leave it alone. You leave it alone as if you never even asked it. And when you leave everything alone, when you stop trying to tinker with it, when you stop trying to make it any better, you may begin to notice that the only thing that ever thinks that you need to do anything other than leave it alone is your mind. There's nothing in the space in the room. There's nothing in the stars overhead. There's nothing in the trees or the air you breathe. There's nothing in the floor you sit on that says you should be trying to do anything more than just sit down right now. Outside of your mind, everything is content. It's just as it is. It knows no other way to be. Just allowing yourself, your being, to just receive what it feels like to be in a universe that at this moment is not asking anything of you. What's it like to have no demand placed upon you? No alternative motive? No goal being laid out in front of you? Now you may simply find yourself receiving this directionless invitation. You may find that at some moments your mind, the narrative in your mind, will think that you need to do something other than just sit here. That your mind may have its narrative, its waking dream about what it means to sit here, whether you're good at it or not, whether it's going the way you want it to or not, whether it's of any use or not. But essentially, it's all just a waking dream. All the thoughts. And notice how no outside agency is even at all concerned about the thoughts. It's trying to change them or suggest that they be otherwise. truth of your being, even the universe all around, has no real relationship with the thoughts that arise. Nothing's against them any more than a bird is bothered by the sky that it flies in. And the same is true of a feeling, emotion. Notice how everything presents itself in a field of stillness, in a field of awareness. That field of stillness and awareness, notice it's not in opposition to anything that arises, whether it be a noise, sound, thought, feeling. At certain moments, you may notice how artful and intelligent the mind is in getting your attention. All thought craves to be believed. And even that is perfectly okay. So by accepting everything, nothing constrains you.
So we're reading from Adyashanti's Resurrecting Jesus, and we're in chapter 7 still. Adyashanti has been talking about how the miracles that Jesus performed always had say a deeper, more profound message, that the healing was actually subsequent to what Jesus was actually sharing and exposing about the truth. So now we're at a section called Destroying All Boundaries. Now, when Jesus heals the paralytic by forgiving his sins, he upsets the Pharisees, who can be seen as the religious fundamentalists or radicals of the time. The reason they're so angry is that, from their viewpoint, God is the only one who has the capacity to forgive sins. The religious institutions that Jesus was born into and often found himself surrounded by were very threatened by his presence. In their minds, his actions were ultimate sins. Jesus was forgiving sins, healing people, and attracting great crowds. All these were real threats to the religious powers of the day. This theme of relationship to power appears in many of Jesus's healings because the religious hierarchy is very unsettled by the presence of Jesus. In a certain sense, their power has been usurped by a great power. In Jesus, the power of Spirit itself was awakened. It's a constant reminder to these religious institutions that their hierarchical power pales in comparison to the power of divine being that Jesus is and that he represents in these stories. The power structures are upset by Jesus's power, and we see this theme arise again and again throughout the Gospels. There's another encounter between Jesus and the Pharisees, in which Jesus and his disciples are dining at Levi's house. The Gospel of Mark reads, "While Jesus is having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him." Mark 2:15. These sinners are people of ill repute on the lowest rungs of society, and tax collectors were even less popular in the ancient world than they are now. In the ancient world, taxation was a very personal transaction, because a tax collector could demand money from you right on the spot. For Jesus, a spiritual figure of great magnitude, to be sitting down with the lowest rungs of society was simply not acceptable at the time. In the ancient world, there was a very clear stratification of society, similar to Indian society, with the Brahmins at the top and the untouchables at the lowest rung. There were clear boundaries around whom you could associate and with whom you couldn't, between who was clean and pure and who was unclean and impure. Jesus crossed all of those boundary lines, destroying them at almost every turn. In the eyes of the Pharisees, Jesus has done something terrible. A high spiritual figure dining with the lowest classes. People in positions of power are on the highest rungs in society. In order to keep their high status, in order to be seen as mighty and noble, they need to have people that are seen as lesser. From a religious point of view, these distinctions mattered deeply, but to Jesus, they didn't matter at all. Jesus destroys the boundaries that separate people because that's what spirit does. It sees the unity of all beings. It sees what we all share in common instead of what separates us and divides us. Another of the healing stories begins when Jesus enters the temple. There he encounters a man with a shriveled hand. The religious authorities are watching him to see if he would dare to heal the man on the Sabbath. Jesus knows what the authorities are thinking, and he asks the crippled man to stand. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Mark 3, 5, and 6. This is a real turning point in the Jesus story. Jesus has gone into the temple, and his mere presence is antagonistic to those in power. He's noticed the Pharisees watching him and whispering, looking down at him. This is a very human emotion he's experiencing. He notices what's going on around him and becomes outraged. He's angry because he can feel the divisions within them, the hierarchies of religious authority. He's put off by all the divisions that human beings create. Essentially, he's just put off by the mind. He sees the mind dividing, which of course is just what the mind does. But Jesus can't stand for the unicity of all beings and tolerate the mind or believe the mind and what it does. It separates and divides and says this and that and yours and mine. There's another scripture in the Bible, I'm not remembering where it's at. It's the New Testament, I believe. It is the New Testament. And Jesus says to one of his disciples that he is just before praising and very happy that this disciple had just had such clear seeing. And then the disciple says something that is of the mind. And Jesus says to him, "Get behind me, Satan." And it's to me what it feels like, what Jesus is doing here. He's saying, I won't kowtow to the mind and to the activities of division. I stand for the truth. So he acts very abruptly, even sternly, saying to the man with the withered hand, stretch out your hand. The man stretches out his hand and boom, he's healed right on the spot. This story has less to do with healing than with Jesus breaking the boundary lines of the religious power structure. It's telling us something very important about spirit, our true divine being. We tend to live in a state where our true being, our true sovereignty, our true power is hidden away inside. It's tucked deep in the shadowy corners of our unconscious, so that the egoic mind, with its wants and its desires and its love of power, and even its love of being a victim of life, can have full reign. But when spirit begins to awaken within you, you feel that it is a force that is uncontainable. This is often when people begin to pull back. They're seeking enlightenment, seeking God, seeking the ultimate nature of reality. But when they begin to touch upon it, it's not what they expect it to be. It's a force of great inner vitality, untamed and untamable. It breaks through all of the mind structures that perpetuate separation. This theme of breaking through all structures of ignorance and separation is the driving force of Jesus' life. Now, Jesus doesn't break through structures just to break through them. He has no inherent problem with authority. It's only the corruption of power that angers him. He's not fighting against power and authority per se. Jesus himself is an extraordinarily powerful being, and he operates with great inner authority. His life is a life of spirit, and spirit breaks down the false power structures, first in your own mind, and then in the outside world. It's transcendence. In the Gospel, spirit is a dynamic and unpredictable source of vitality and liberation. Many of the societal and religious rules keep the human heart contained, and as a result, most human beings feel boxed in. Unfortunately, when we turn to religion, often the churches box us in even more. They tell us that we are inherently flawed, that we need to be forgiven for this sin, this stain that we carry. The first and most important function of religion is to connect you with the mystery of life and the mystery of your own being. When religion fails to do this, it has betrayed its primary mission, and all we are left with is dogma and belief. The churches, synagogues, and temples of all religions are entrusted with this, to interpret the old stories and teachings so they open to the transcendent mystery of life, not so they confine us in the egoic state through fear, guilt, and repression. In my teaching work, I constantly meet people who were brought up in the church that at some point turned away from their religion because they were tired of hearing over and over again that their fundamental nature was flawed, that simply to be born was sort of a cosmic mistake in which they were forever burdened with the stain of sin. Many people receive this sort of message from their childhood religion and at some point reject it because it's so painful, most importantly, because it doesn't correspond with their inner intuition. One of the reasons I think it's so powerful to renew our understanding of the Jesus story is because it's the foundational story of Western culture, and it dominates so much of our lives, even if we don't think of ourselves as Christian at all. There are beautiful things about the Christian message, about Jesus' message, and about the presence that Jesus represents, but often it doesn't come through in the churches we attend. Jesus' message was about intimate, personal, immediate access to divine being, the kingdom of heaven within. That's what he preached. For him, there was no intermediary. No priest was necessary to connect you with the mystery of God, only an open heart and an open mind. This viewpoint got him in a lot of trouble with religious authorities of the time, because his power structure almost always claimed to be a necessary intermediary between you and the divine. In Jesus' time, just as today, many religious institutions fail to fulfill their primary directive, which is to connect us with our spiritual nature. Trust in things unseen. Soon after healing the man with the withered hand, Jesus is followed by a large crowd who press in around him. People are intrigued by his charismatic, spiritually charged being. Word is spreading fast, and more people are coming to listen to him and to be with him. Now, as he's walking through a crowd, a woman who has suffered from bleeding for 12 years reaches out and touches his garment. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Mark 5:29. Jesus immediately realized what had happened, and he turns to the crowd and asks, "Who touched my clothes?" Finally, the woman comes forward, fearfully, and kneels at his feet. And Jesus says to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Mark 5:34. This story brings out another important truth about healing. Jesus doesn't say, "I healed you, daughter, go in peace." He says, "Your faith has made you well. Now go in peace." It's not the power of Jesus that heals people. In fact, Jesus says over and over again that he's doing the work of the Father, and he's a conduit through which the healing presence moves and functions. And so Jesus is always very clear that his human self does not contain all the power, that the human self is not the healer, that the human self is not the powerful, charismatic being. He attributes all those powers to the realm of spirit, the kingdom of God. He heals the woman. What heals the woman is her faith, her trust in things unseen. Usually we think of faith simply as something we believe in the absence of proof. In the modern day, faith is almost always associated with some sort of belief structure. But Jesus never defines what someone must have faith in. He doesn't say, "Your faith in me has healed you." Rather, It's faith itself, the trust in things unseen, that heals. So, what does it mean to trust in something you can't see? We can't see the majority of life structures. We can't see the atoms or the electrons or the vast emptiness that comprises the physical object with the naked eye. All objects are more nothing than something. In other words, there's more space within them than there is physical substance. And yet, when we look at a chair or our face in the mirror, what we see is the form. We don't see that within the form there is actually more emptiness, more of the unseen than the seen. We can't see gravity either, but we experience gravity every moment of our lives. Without it, we'd all just float away. Love is a very real experience central to human existence. We come into existence by love. We are sustained through life by love. And hopefully, when we die into love. We surrender into love. But what is love? We can't see it. We can't weigh it. It has no color. And yet, it's a very, very real thing. And so, when Jesus talks about faith, he's alluding to the power to trust in something you can't see or even comprehend with the dualistic mind. And yet, faith can open you to an order of reality far beyond ordinary perception. That reality is what Jesus called the kingdom of heaven, what in other traditions is called enlightenment. And enlightenment cannot be grasped with your mind, it can only be awoken to. It is a complete change of perception from ordinary egoic consciousness to the consciousness of unity and completeness. This is what faith can open you up to if you have faith in the still point within yourself. Find that place within yourself where nothing ever moves. And through that, you can gain entrance into the kingdom. When people are in despair or great suffering, those are the moments when human beings start to open up to other possibilities. It's as if suffering stretches our capacity to consider that there are other energies in life, things that we can't see, that we haven't learned about, but that we might reach out to. There's an old saying, quote, "There are no atheists in a foxhole," end quote. When your life is on the line, you naturally reach out to a higher divinity. Now, some may argue that when you're frightened, you make things up to help you through that difficult time, and perhaps there's some truth to that. But in my experience, both in my own life and in what I've been told by many people over the years, when we suffer, it does open us in some way. When life is going well, the egoic mind thinks it's in control and it's got this whole thing figured out. People tend not to look into the deeper mystery of their existence when everything is going well. But when life isn't going so well, when we're in a place of strain, of anxiety, of sorrow, that's when people start to consider other possibilities. In the Zen Buddhist tradition that I come from, A great emphasis is placed on meditation. It took me a long time to realize that to meditate, to sit there in silence, is actually an act of great faith. To sit in silence is to let go of the dualistic mind, of the ego that believes, I must be in control of my spiritual life. I must be leading it in order for anything to happen. But when we sit in silence and stillness, we're letting go of that. To meditate is an act of faith. It is the highest form of prayer. It's the silent prayer in which we open up to the divine mystery of our own existence. That's really the essence of meditation. Often, when people meditate, they're trying very hard to control their minds, to keep certain thoughts from appearing. This act shows they have no faith at all. Their meditation is a completely ego driven activity. I'm not saying such activity has no part to play, no usefulness, but ultimately, to connect us with the mystery of being, an act of faith is required. To have faith is to let go of control. It's to release the ego's instinct to always be in charge. So faith opens up that aspect of the ego that wants to control everything and think that it has all the answers. This is what faith is: an opening of the heart, an opening of the mind. Jesus knew from his own experience that when you open your heart and mind, you literally open yourself to the healing presence. You open yourself to that which can transform you physically, spiritually, and psychologically. To be open is the act of faith. This is extraordinarily important in all of the healing stories of Jesus. In fact, I find it interesting in these stories that people come to Jesus in order to be healed, but when they see him, they also understand something about his true nature. As we go through the story, we'll see that often his own disciples are very quite baffled by him. They're attracted to him, but they don't really understand who and what he is. Of course, the religious hierarchy is threatened by him and doesn't know what to make of him either. The Gospels show Jesus as a man who was very much alone, probably one of the most alone human beings who ever walked the earth. Why? Because throughout his entire life, almost no one really and truly understood him, understood the significance of who he was and what he was doing. Yet the people who did have an intuition about who and what he was were those who sought healing. It's as if their suffering opened them and allowed them to see something about him that many others didn't see. And so I think this is another example of the way that suffering can stretch us, stretch our hearts, but also stretch our perception. When our perception opens, we can intuit things that we couldn't intuit before. The sick and the needy have a way of intuiting who Jesus really is. In a number of examples, they receive not only physical healing, but a deep spiritual healing as well. So maybe we'll just take a moment, just allow attention to rest. just on this beingness, the place where no division can be. The place in us where there's utter stillness. This I am, or God consciousness. But even if we push aside all of those labels and we just see what's here, what cannot not be here. Allow attention to explore this place that can't not be here. Can it find any suffering here in this place? Place of no division. We might notice this place is always here, always here. You might even say that it's here-ness itself. And we might dare to ask, who sees this here-ness? What sees? Follow the pointing to the place of no object, not even the I am, not even the beingness. Even beyond the concept of nothing, beyond the concept of emptiness. In the space, even space arises. Whatever the mind offers here as description or criticism, this that is, the seeing itself, offers no resistance. It is yes itself, allowing for all. May we all consciously live in a place of no divisions. Om Sri Sat Guru Muji Ji Ki Jai. Om Sri Sat Guru Anantaji Ki Jai. Om Sri Christ Ki Jai. Adyashanti Ki Jai. Om Namah Shivaya.